I'm Perry Schmunk. I'm one of the founding partners of the Professional Ski Instructors of Canada, the PSIC. Jeff, who I'll let introduce himself in a second here, also a partner with the PSIC. Jennifer Fraser is with us today. We're so excited to speak to you, Jennifer. For those of you that don't know Jennifer Fraser, her latest book out is The Bullied Brain. She's a PhD in comparative literature, and we stumbled across her book. I suggest for everyone that's listening to find out more about Jennifer, you can go to bulliedbrain.com. There's a tab that says Meet Jennifer, and you can get kind of a full background of what she brings to the table. Jennifer, we're so excited to talk to you. I might turn it over to Jeff to get started.
Thanks, Barry. And yeah, likewise, thanks, Jennifer. I mean, this is exciting. It wasn't that long ago that I got into your book, and I do a lot of audiobook listening because I drive a lot. And I guess, the reason I reached out originally, one, it was unbelievably compelling, partly because it took a lot of the other books that I had been reading with some concepts that resonated and I thought were really interesting, and kind of suddenly smashed them all together in a place that really made sense to me, both personally and professionally with having been involved in the ski industry for a long time and so on. So anyway, that was where I reached out to you, and thanks for responding. Your response was awesome right off the bat. I could sense the excitement with and the drive and the commitment to what you do, and I think that's really what made me reach out to you originally was that sort of sense of this being a real thing and something that you're speaking from true experience and expertise and education and research and so on. So yeah, super excited to be here and to be doing this and to start to move forward in a way that hopefully can help us all mutually in our own um, things that we're doing with our lives, and also to transfer that to people that are moving along in their worlds as well. So yeah, thanks for doing this.
Well, thanks for having me and for our many conversations we've had. And I love Perry's slip of the tongue, his Freudian slip about competitive
Competitive
literature.
literature.
Competitive literature. The reason why I love it is a lot of the work that I do when I work with sports organizations is there's this horrible myth that's emerged that somehow if you care about people, you care about your learners, you care about athletes, somehow you're no longer competitive. And that's the biggest lie out there. It's one of the myths that I seek to debunk in my book. So in The Bullied Brain, as you guys both know, we've had lots of talks and you've read it. The idea is to look at, well, what does the science say? What does the brain science say about competition? What does it say about performance? And what do they really actually know about what it takes to make a great athlete? And what it takes to make a great athlete is caring about them, is treating them like a human being, is developing their intellectual and emotional and physical self, a holistic approach. There's not one single research paper, not one single study that any researcher will put their name to that argues that in order to create a great athlete or a competitive program, you need to decimate them, put them down, manipulate them, or do any of these negative behaviors that we're seeing emerging, especially not just in Canadian sport. It's emerging worldwide. It's been exposed worldwide. So we have, and this is what the three of us are excited about, we have an excellent opportunity to replace the mythology that's not serving our athletes or our organizations with science, brain science in particular.
If I can go from there, Jennifer, we as an organization, like any ski instructor organization, one thing that is core of what we do is knowing how to ski. What does that really look like? And we as an organization took an approach, and I'm going to use this term as a first principles approach. So what is ski technique? Well, let's boil it down to the science of what's needed and so on. Versus, because there's a lot of opinion out there, right? So that's on the physical side of it. Actually, what happens when a person skis. When I first and like Jeff, when I first consumed your book, it wasn't Audible because I travel a lot, listen to it on a run. And as I started to understand and absorb, your work, what I realized is this is a first principle approach to everything that is the brain, right? Like my point being is, like ski instruction, like the actual physical part of skiing, there's a lot of, I don't even know what label to put on it, but there's a lot of just assumption of what's really going on versus where you cite the actual research. What does it say, about the brain? Like, and if I could go into maybe a first question, because as I've been a huge advocate of sharing, your work with people. Say, hey, you gotta get into this book. It's really good. And one of the first responses that people get is they interpret that, oh, it's about being soft, and that's not what you need to be a high performer. But, and I'll let you speak to that. Like, what does the science actually say?
Well, I mean, because I do lots of presentations to sports organizations, and I have for years, I always get asked that question. And I know, as I walk into the room, I've been in front of audiences of 300 where you just literally see them roll their eyes like, oh no, it's the safe sport presentation. Oh, and
Yeah.
I often will use, this is a really fast, great example, and it's a very sort of cultural one that everyone can capture quickly, regardless of whatever sport you're working in, which is Tom Brady. So Tom Brady, the quarterback, is a really good example of how, if we paid a little bit of attention to our soft wired brain, because our brain isn't hardwired. We aren't born
Right.
in, set for life, and it's all kind of wired up like a computer at 5. That's a very outdated notion. We now know from years of research that our brains are actually soft wired, which means they change based on our environment and based on how we are interacting with others. So, just in a nutshell, if you're in a toxic environment, it's going to wire your brain in a particular way. It's going to change it, physically change it. If you are being abused by a parent or a coach or a teacher, someone who has power over you, it's going to change the shape of your brain. It's going to change how it's wired. So our brains, all the way until our last day on the planet, are changing. And this is why it's incredibly important to be in healthy environments, and it's incredibly important to have empathic, caring, respectful coaching and teaching and parenting. I can't stress that enough. So let's use Tom Brady as our example. Now imagine back in the day, he's getting chosen for the draft, and they're all looking at his body. And they're saying his body does not look like a quarterback's body. This guy is 199. Like, he's really not very good. Look at that guy. He's too tall, too skinny. He's not quarterback material. Give the kid a chance. We'll choose him 199. Now, I can tell you that if they had brought me in back in the day and let me talk to the guys making the draft decisions, I would have said to them, how many of you guys have looked at his brain? And there would not have been a single one that said, you know what, we did an EEG of Tom Brady's brain, and we just cannot believe that, and we did a battery of tests, and we cannot believe his processing speed, his working memory, his ability to concentrate, his empathy, because he's able to understand not only where his teammates are out in the field, he knows what the opposition's doing. And I mean, this is the absolute key. If they had looked at
Right.
Brady's brain, they would have chosen him number one. And where my work dovetails with Tom Brady is that I work with Dr. Michael Merznick, who's one of the world's leading, most highly awarded neuroscientists alive today. And he was working with a team of international neuroscientists in a lab. And this is, years ago, quite a number of years ago. And they were studying neuroscientific programming and training that they could do that would stop people from getting Alzheimer's. Well, they get a telephone call in the lab, and it's Alex Guerrero, and he's Tom Brady's trainer. And he's like, hey, just neuroscientists wanted to let you know, you do know that Tom Brady uses your brain training program every day. Well, you could have heard a pin drop, because they had
Right.
absolutely no idea. They thought they were designing this for older people. And one of the world's greatest athletes, one of the greatest football players ever to have been seen, is using this program every day. They couldn't believe it. So they packed everything up. Off they went to meet with Tom Brady. And Tom Brady built the use of this brain training program called Brain HQ into his TB12 method,
Yep.
so he can teach other athletes how to use it. Now, I don't know what you guys think, but in general, when I think of Tom Brady, I don't think soft.
Well, no, and it's so interesting because, and I think, you go into this in the book a few times as well. Like what our body, so I think of you telling the Tom Brady story. So everybody, whatever, all the scouts, all the general managers in that room looking whether do they pick them or not, that was determined by their bias, right? And I think you use a term in the book like You got to get comfortable outside of the bias of our background, or something to that effect, like, which is, and I think that applies to the ski instruction world as well. We look at people and make some assumptions based on what we think. One of the early things that like hit home with me of your book is, there's a quote in the book that, based on the research, that says, and I want to get it right, is our brains are as unique as our fingerprints, right? So like it's that unique. And as opposed to, if I'm meeting a client for the first time, it's real easy for me to form some biases based on my background and whatever. And what I've found in use as I've become more aware of your material is I suspend that judgment as long as I can to truly connect with the person and find out where they're coming from. Anyways, my point being is it's like the Tom Brady story. Like if you're only looking at it at one, one element of a lens, you're going to miss something.
Absolutely. It's a great one actually for all coaches and teachers and parents and one another, in a corporation, in a sports organization, in any of these settings, because we all have unique brains, and we do. And then on top of that, our brains have all been wired differently. When you meet someone, you don't know their life history, you don't know what they've been through, and you don't know how their brain got wired. So why would you make any kind of assumption at all based on their physical presentation? I mean, that said, we human beings are extremely good at reading all sorts of nonverbal signs, and it's on a very unconscious level. But what's so fascinating in what you said, Perry, is the idea that your brain has been wired to think certain ways, to interpret the world in certain ways, and to construct reality and interpersonal relationships in a certain way. And we can all unpack that for ourselves. And it makes us so much more self-aware, because our brains do a lot of things automatically, and they do a lot of things based on wiring. So when you talk about thoughts, really what you're saying is my brain was wired to make these assumptions. Like the draft, the guys making the decisions around the football
Yeah.
players, their brains were wired to think certain things. It wasn't a bad thing. It was just how they were wired. And then this, what I really like in the bullied brain, and what I think is useful about it, when we turn to the neuroscience to give us that little bit of suspension of judgment, for example, is it reminds us to think more medically and a little bit less morally when it comes to how other people act and behave and talk and do things, because we start to see them as having these very organic things that are shaped, these brains, whereas we've been trained not to pay attention to the brain. So I think that's one of the most important takeaways for all of us, is that our brains are organic, they're inextricably entwined with our bodies, and they are also totally shaped by history, environment, and choices that we make.
Right.
Well, and Jennifer, if I can for a second, I want to go back to something you said about Tom Brady. Like if you had been a scout, you mentioned things like processing speed and empathy, communication, and that kind of thing. Just if you can, because like one of the things I really loved about the book is that it is based on neuroscience. This isn't just your opinion about things that you've observed and that kind of thing. And this might be a really simple question, but if you were to describe brain health and brain fitness, what are they? Are they basically some of those things you brought up in the Tom Brady example? Can you go into that a little bit?
If you look at the idea of a holistic athlete, let's use that as an example. If you just train the physical body of a human being, and you give it shelter, let's say, and you give it food. So I'm talking from a neuroscience research point of view right now. So what we've learned from the neuroscientists and the neurobiologists and the doctors and psychiatrists and psychologists, they have done extensive research on this. And what they know is the human self does not actually develop or flourish when it only has the physical. You can give it shelter and you can give it food, and it will self-destruct. So we are accustomed in our society right now, we're still quite locked into the model, like the Maslow's hierarchy model, where we think that food and shelter are necessary to advance to higher level. From a neuroscience point of view, brain health, brain fitness point of view, that's inaccurate. What we now know is, including other mammals, so we can include monkeys in this, for example. We can include dogs in this. There's been extensive research that shows if they don't have respectful, loving, predictable, caring connection with other mammals, they self-destruct in terrible ways. Like, we don't have to go into the research now. You've read it in the book. I try not to spend too long on it because it's pretty soul destroying. But that's true for the human mammal. The human animal needs connection just as much as it needs physical things like training to be a better skier, training to be an exceptional football player, training to do whatever. So when you talk brain fitness, people think, I have to go into the brain gym and I have to work out and I understand this and the brain is like a muscle and I'm going to have mental toughness and sports is a mental game. And that's all great. And that's all true. And there's lots that we could talk about, the three of us, as we have before, about that aspect of brain training and brain fitness. It's very true. But that's only one part of it. The brain will only be exceptional. It will only fulfill its potential. It will only achieve at the highest level that whatever has been set for it, if it has connection. And connection is where the emotional and the intellectual and the ethical, that's where that all comes in. And if you are not supplying that as a coach or as a teacher or a parent or a boss in an organization, if you are not bringing that in, then you will not have a healthy brain. You will have an unsafe brain that is in a state of constant anxiety, depression, self-harm, all of the things that we're seeing with youth today. And it is literally hitting crisis proportions. And we know that, but we're not talking about why is it? And we do know some things. They spend too much time on screens. Screens are disconnecting. Brains are organic. They need human interaction in person. They don't need screens. Screens are great, they're useful for work, whatever, but they're not good for kids' brains in particular. And we're reaping the rewards of this over technical world that we've created for ourselves. But that's brain health, brain fitness, there's a lot more to say, but just big picture, I think that's an important sort of vision to start with.
Jennifer, if I can add something to what you said, and this is a road, whether you are aware or not, that you got me to go down, which is this. So again, if in the world of ski instruction, I think most ski instructors, they're quite concerned of giving physical guidance. You need to do X, Y, to make the ski turn and so on. In reading your book, it's taken me down a few avenues of doing more research, and one of the things was, you've appeared at least 3 times on this podcast, Way of the Champions. And so I in listening to your content on some of those episodes, that then got me to listen to that same podcast interviewed Steve Kerr. Steve Kerr, like, I think if I get the numbers right, 5 NBA championships as a player with the Chicago Bulls, and now a coach of the Golden State Warriors with, whatever, one of the best athletes on the planet, Steve Kerr. So this is where I'm going with this. When you talk to us about how important the brain is and its health and its emotion, and in dealing with it, he said a really cool quote, I think, is he said 20% of his job as coach is basketball, and he said maybe it's even 10%. The other 80 or 90% is dealing with the 14 people, which is, on one end of the scale, is all the support that needs to be given to, like an absolute A-list superstar athlete like Steph Curry, down to the last guy on the bench that is worrying, will he have a job tomorrow? Because if he gets cut, that probably means the end of his NBA career. And I just, in digesting your stuff and then seeing that quote about him talking about the importance of dealing with the human emotionally, emotionally, intellectually, so key. And I also know, and maybe I'll open up the door to you, because in your book, you talk about Phil Jackson's approach with the Bulls and mindfulness and so on, and how important that was in his strategy. If I can let you maybe carry on with that thought.
Yeah, I mean, if we take all of that sort of rich exchange and we look at ski instructors, if I was a ski instructor, and you can set me straight on this if I'm off on it, if I was a ski instructor, I would be thinking to myself, I want my athletes to ski really well because they're going to be in danger. They're going to be at very high speeds. And I can teach them ways to stay safe. And that is my number one priority. The last thing I'd ever want to see in a million years is one of my athletes get hurt. So I think probably that's quite foremost in their mind. And they want to create champions and all these things. And that's awesome. But I think where we can go full circle and look at the Steph Currys of the world and how they need to be managed, and then the guy at the end of the bench and how he needs to be managed, and coaching. What an exceptional coach is also doing is saying, how do they feel emotionally, intellectually, career-wise, livelihood, their future? How do they feel on the safety level? Because if they don't feel safe, we know this from a neuroscientific nervous system research place. If they don't feel safe, they are not going to perform.
Right.
So they will not ever be able to achieve the kinds of things that they actually have the potential to achieve, because they are in what's the fight, they're in flight, and they're in freeze. And again, that's a larger conversation. Those are buzzwords most people know, but they don't know the science behind it. And the science behind it is really, it's a bit of a game changer, because you start to understand that as soon as the brain is worried about something other than playing basketball, or as soon as the brain is worried about something other than skiing safely and powerfully and at high speeds, you're not really working with your athlete fully anymore. So we need to, going into the 21st century further with all this knowledge we have from the brain science, we need to bring those two concepts together. I want you to be physically safe, because that's how you're going to be safe and achieve your potential. I want you to be intellectually and emotionally safe, because your brain badly needs that for you to fulfill your potential and to be a great athlete and to be physically safe. You can't just take one portion out. The human self is a brain and a body and a soul,
And we know that as ski instructors, you can so easily destroy a day by stress. And let's say by taking somebody to train that at that moment in time they're not ready for, they're not in the right, I'll use this word, it's like, headspace, if you will, to deal with it. And in some cases that might be exactly what's needed for them to get a sense of adventure and accomplishment and so on. But in some cases that can be destroying. And as an instructor, it's so important to be aware and manage that, if you will. Like that, I think that's one of the big tools that we have as instructors, is facilitating when and where you can challenge somebody. And first and foremost, you got to be aware of that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and and Perry, that's actually exactly what was on my mind. Like, we often, I think in our world, like we've got the drive and the goal of the professional in the industry who wants to be sustainable. They want to be a great teacher, a great skier. There is a certification pathway that comes along with that. They want to achieve milestones within that. And so there's like a very intrinsic personal side to the achievement. When the time comes where you're up against that evaluation or that test or whatever, how do you perform, right? How do you get into that performance brain where you're just going to go out there and you're going to do the thing and you're not going to overthink, and which is, a little bit more of a, competitor analogy. But I think there's another aspect to it, which I think is really the biggest part of what we do, which is we are the people who are out there constantly facilitating learners who may be in just as heightened a performance anxiety, if I can put it that way, just in learning how to turn for the first time. How does the ski instructor, who's maybe listening to this, or lots of experience, not that much experience, it doesn't really matter. Like, in your opinion, what are some of the things that ultimately, and I'm kind of thinking back to it's the brain that we're teaching. Are there any sort of high level, if you will, thoughts or pointers or advice that you have that that the ski instructors should be looking at, without needing to become the neuroscience expert, but rather to be able to call it read the signs, or recognize that for them, they may have done this 1,000 times, they may have gone through this lesson a whole bunch of times, but for that person they're teaching, this is attempt number one. What do they need to be considering, and how do they pay attention to the right things?
It's a really great question. I think that we can think about the Steve Kerr approach in this moment, because imagine if Steve Kerr was being interviewed on that podcast, and he said, "Yeah, I've got this number one guy, Steph Curry, and it's really where I put my attention. He's a superstar. He's the big money. He's my guy, and I just I try to give some time to the other team members, but the bottom line is I let them figure it out for themselves. I'm focused on the superstar." And he doesn't challenge me in any way. He understands exactly what I'm saying. He actually, makes me redundant kind of. I almost watch and I glory in his success. Now that's one way of being a coach. And I think for the ski instructor who works more one-on-one in the sense of not managing a team per se, if they change their mentality to say this is a team sport, they would quickly understand that when you do lots of one-on-one work to facilitate someone else's achievement, you are constantly depleting your body budget. And that body budget is a neuroscience term. Your brain is constantly drawing on your energy for you to be able to ask the right questions, notice the right signs, be surprised, be caring, hold back your temper when you feel frustrated, be a great cheerleader, even when the person's not doing very well. All of those things are depleting. So what's really important for the ski instructor is to understand how much the ski instructor community is the team. And if you can't go back to your team and know that they've got your back and that you can tell them you had a crash and burn day, it was a disaster, and they're going to say, you know what, I've been through that. Let me give you some of my key pointers, or who you and I should talk to about this is so and so because he's got a lot of experience, or she's been through this before with a client that was a disaster. These are some of the things she learned. Like, if you don't have that organic community, team-based, relationship-based connection with your team, then you are not going to be the greatest ski instructor you can. It's not just you and the learner that's really at play here. It's you and the team, and then you bring the best self to the learner. And that comes from collaboration. That comes from care. And we should be spending a lot more time in our organizations on building that kind of respectful, trusting, caring community. And okay, so going back to the learner though, your relationship to the learner, I think we can go back to something that Perry was talking about at the very beginning. Are you coming at that learner with judgment, or are you coming at that learner with curiosity and questions? Hey, I feel you're a bit low today. Is that right? Like, perspective taking. Is that right? Like, are you okay? How are you doing? What do you feel would be the best thing to do today? Or, I sense you're afraid. What's your fear? Let's unpack this together. I've been afraid before. I know what it's like.
Yeah.
I mean, just that sort of human to human care is going to make a huge difference versus projecting onto them your own insecurity. I want to be the best I'm getting tested. I want to achieve this goal. I want to get through the program as fast as possible. We all have these anxieties. We're all under pressure. But if we let that pressure override relationship with our team or with our learner, we're never going to be our best coach. And just let me finish on one little thing. All of this is to say, the brain learns by making mistakes. So we need to be a culture that starts being much more compassionate and kind of excited, because your ski instructor comes back to the group and says, I just had the worst day I had the worst day ever. I was the worst teacher ever. And we've all been there. Anyone who's ever taught or coached or parented has been there. And the group doesn't say to you, judgment, you're a terrible person, you're a bad person, we don't want you in the community, you're a failure. They say to you, you know what? Brain learns by making mistakes. You probably learned a ton today that you wouldn't have learned if you'd been the perfect instructor.
On that, and I was looking at some of my notes, and you just went there, Jennifer, because I think, and I can't speak that closely to other cultures, like let's just say the education system or whatever, and I think maybe it's like society overall, but for sure there's an element in the tradition of being a ski instructor where a mistake is not embraced. It's not, we're not accepting it as, what, it's actually key to the learning process. Yeah, for sure. And I think of it, in my world as a ski instructor, it impacts the group that I might be teaching, but then then the community of ski school that I'm then in as well, right? Like, and I think we all are better off the more we accept that it's part of the process. Well, not and if I'm getting you right, it's not necessary. It's not just part of the process. It's essential to the process. Yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of needs to be, I mean, it needs to be addressed as expected, right? That in the process of learning, that the mistakes aren't things that you're trying to avoid as you go. Like, sure, like mistakes that lead to injury and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. Like our job out there is to be cognizant of that and to put that first. But yeah, like accepting the fact that being willing to step into a learning process means being willing to step into the fact that those mistakes are going to be made. Like, Jennifer, I want to read back to you a quote from you and it's interesting to listen to you talk through what you just did. It's almost like you're reading the notes on my page here, but it's actually from an interview that you did in December 2023 with Canvas Rebel. And you said this, when teams are heard and treated with empathy and compassion, when it's understood that brains learn by making mistakes, when brains fitness is prioritized as part of health, then the sky is the limit. When teams are challenged, when the expectations are high, and when meritocracy is honored and manipulation is not tolerated, the sky is the limit. Which I think is like you said something earlier on in that last comment, which is I think a really important aspect for us, which is as much as ski instructing is, it isn't often a team event, if I can put it that way, from the aspect of the ski instructor working in real time with other ski instructors. I tend to think of it as a bit of a team event with, the instructor and the people that they're working with. But the reality is that as a community and as an organization, whether it's our organization or any other, I think what you said to me really resonates. I think it's bang on that the way the organization gets better and the way that the people within it get better is when there is that ability to go back and one, know that there's empathy in that group and to be honest with them and just go, man, I had a rough day today, or I tried this or I tried that, and not get the response of, oh, I can't believe you didn't do that, you did this or you didn't do that, or even just the flood of advice that we sometimes get from people versus just recognition that sometimes that happens.
Mhm.
Right. Sometimes that flood of advice can actually be a confirmation that, yes, in fact, you did it wrong. And it's right. So anyway, just the empathy of knowing, and Perry and I have talked about, actually, our whole team's talked about this sometimes, is the importance of knowing also when it's actually not time to teach. Right. Like when it's time to let the community aspect of it and the support kind of bubble to the top, and then go from there. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting because what you just commented on was kind of exactly what was in front of me. It was something that caught my eye as I was reading through some of your stuff. But yeah,
If I can
that's
just
awesome.
jump in, Jeff,
Yeah.
like with this idea of what I'm trying to get at, I think, with organizational culture. So the idea that your organization is your team, and that we underestimate how incredibly important that is,
Mm.
and the kinds of work that if we put more work into that relationship, we might be better in our one-on-one relationships or with our learners. A really important thing to understand from a brain point of view, this is all backed in research, of course, is that the more powerful people get, the less empathy they have.
Mm.
And so we all experience this as human beings on the planet. We know that people that have enormous amounts of political power, for example, or military power, they really don't bat an eye at decimating others, right? That's very, very, very low empathy. And that's because they have off the charts power. And there's more complex parts to this. For example, there's lots of experiments that show you would not be able to do something because of your empathy. You wouldn't be able to do it personally to another human being, like push them in front of an oncoming train. But if you were the guy in the back room that had to press the switch, and if you press the switch that was going to make the train hit the guy, and you knew it was going to save 5 other people's lives, you could do it because your empathy is distance. Like there's lots of complexities to it. But the bottom line is, in organizations where power rules the day, and certain people are invested with a great deal of power, it can lend itself to very negative interactions like you're describing, Jeff, where you don't feel safe, you don't have the trust, they don't have your back, they don't have enough understanding maybe, so all they can do is laser in on the mistake you've made and give you advice. I mean, these kinds of things, if we want healthy organizations and brain safe organizations, not just body safe
Mm.
organizations, and therefore sky's the limit for the organization, we have to start talking that way, and we have to start bringing in this scientific research that's just sitting there available for all of us.
And I don't know if we've shared this, Jennifer, but we're a new organization, so we've now finished our first year of operating. Most ski instructor bodies across the world, they have some fairly formal exam or evaluation processes and so on. And you'll see where I'm going with this in a second. What we decided to do is an ongoing evaluation, which I would argue we know it's hit, like it's worked for the feedback we're getting from the participants, their feelings of, because even when they're unsuccessful at meeting that certification level, they're still thankful of the process and so on. And I guess where I'm going with this is, given and I think our approach to it has been influenced by consuming some of your like some of your influence and expertise and so on, um, because I think it's so cool to just embrace the learning process, where as opposed to, like when you put people on the stage and just don't support them, it's just a recipe for unsuccess. I've often shared it, and again, when I use this example, what I'm about to say, it's based on, again, consuming your material. I came across, I don't know, something in a social media feed or whatever. It might even have been Jerry Seinfeld. He talks about his process, and I've often shared this with people. Is like, when you see a comedian and you see them on their Netflix special, they've worked that material many times before we, the general public, see the network special, right? Like, they've worked it in clubs, because it's not just them going through their material, it's seeing how it lands, and they can perfect their timing, their message, so they know how the audience is going to relate. And I think that's kind of cool in our world of training ski instructors. When you take that approach, like, the only way you're really going to get good at it is by working the material, working it in front of a live audience, or in case, a class, and that is a place that you're free to go, what, I can modify the timing of this. I can modify the message. This message didn't hit. And then to also come to the realization, which is something I don't think, maybe I shouldn't make this generalization, but I think sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, as humans, sometimes, if, like, as an example, if I was teaching Jeff and Jeff didn't get it, my first response might be, well, Jeff didn't get it, as opposed to, what did I do? What was, like, maybe it was on me. How could I have facilitated that exercise or that comment or that to make an impact? So I find it just so interesting in giving people the space, as you mentioned earlier, to embrace mistakes so that they can truly learn and move forward.
Well, I mean, it's cool because we've been talking about coaches. So we've talked about how Steve Kerr coaches or how Phil Jackson coached. As you know from the book, one of the people that I think is such a great model. I mean, the whole world
Mm.
thinks he's a great model of a really fabulous teacher is John Wooden. And John Wooden's whole approach is just exactly as you've described. He uses empathy as his way to reach every single individual brain. So he never talks to an athlete as if he has a one size fits all method, like, I'm going to yell in your face, or I'm going to use homophobic slurs, or I'm going to swear at you when you don't get it, or I'm going to swear at you when you do get it, but your talent threatens me, all of these things that we see in abusive, whether it's in the workplace or a school or a sports organization. That is the anti-empathic. That's what I call the bullying abuse paradigm. And people come by it honestly. They've been trained in it and they believe it like a religion. They think it's what creates greatness and success, and they just repeat the pattern. But John Wooden was the opposite. And it's interesting because he did this coming from a literary background. So he was a literature teacher, and literature, of course, is one of the greatest ways that you can build someone's empathy, because every time you read literature, not just regular books that confirm your bias, but literature, you are walking in the shoes of characters who are very different from you. And you're having to experience the world through the lens of their background and feelings and however they're constructed. So it constantly is working your empathy neural networks. Well, John Wooden comes from literature background, literary teacher.
Mm.
He brings this model to every single player, and he doesn't tell them good or bad. He doesn't see himself as an arbiter or a judge. He notices exactly what it is that they need to correct. Like, he's the genius at going, oh, I see, when I tell you to do that particular move, like turn in this particular way, I'm noticing something about your left foot. And that's all he tells them. He doesn't, and he adapts to, so and so needs to hear a really direct comment or they don't get it. So and so needs to hear a comment that allows them to be part of the community building in the team, because that's how they operate. That's how they're kind of constructed. Someone else might need to hear it from a statistic point of view. Hey, in ski instructing, we've learned over the years that all the people that do this with the left foot do better. Everybody has their different unique brain, and that was John Wooden's great gift. It's very neuroscientific in a sense, even though he wasn't, of course, reading the neuroscience.
So then, sorry, like, is it then like, okay, so I agree, like, all brains are different, and actually there was one statement that originally kind of drew me further into your book, which was you said this. I won't get to this verbatim, but if you're going to proclaim to be a teacher, you have to understand something about the brain. And I totally agree. And then as we go deeper, the message that all brains are unique, and therefore there are no sort of one size fits all, or one size fits a demographic, or one size fits a whatever the approach. Is it then, like, to your John Wooden example, like, is it really more about like being really good observers and really good just like unbiased observers and collaborators to really find the best way to teach someone? So regardless of all of your expertise in a subject matter, it's the whole, does it land? And is it really, is it that simple? I hate to put a label on it like that, but is that really is that what it's all about?
That's definitely a huge part of it. That's a huge part. But if we factor in let's factor in a little bit more research, and we could add to that. So what you're describing is what the neuroscientists would call theory of mind. So theory of mind is the ability you have to actually, and it's empathy allows us to do this, right? You ski on someone else's skis. So let's pretend you hit a moment where you teach somebody something from all your knowledge and expertise, and you're pretty good at it, really talented at it, tons of experience. You teach them and they don't get it. So that's a moment for you, a moment where you can go, oh, so-and-so doesn't get it. They're slow. Judgment. Or you go, oh, so-and-so doesn't get it. Let me ski in their skis for a second. That's using your empathy, and see how I might understand things differently from their point of view, theory of mind. Now, theory of mind might allow you, if you ski down the hill in their skis, to go, oh my God, they're doing something no one's ever seen before. If they slightly tweaked it, this would be even better than what I know. Like, you just never know. I mean, we do know athletes who change the game, right? That's the most exciting thing about sports. They do something that we didn't know, that we could never have anticipated. But because we don't tell them they're bad, or they're wrong, or they're slow, or they're never going to learn, or they're never going to be an instructor, we let that happen. Or better still, more realistically, maybe, because there's not all the superstars out there, but we learn that we have to change how we're teaching, because the teaching can't reach them. And as soon as we do theory of mind and empathy, we get to that place. Now, other research we might add into, yes, I'm a very good empathic observer. Another body of research we can add to this is fixed mindset and growth mindset, which you probably come across before. So, but it's a great thing to keep reminding ourselves of. And just let me say a quick sidebar about that. So the brain learns by making mistakes. The brain also learns by repetition at timed intervals. So I can't just say to you guys, and you guys are like, oh yeah, we know growth mindset, we know fixed mindset. Great, the three of us know that. But if we don't remind ourselves every single time we go out on the slopes, we're not getting repetition at timed intervals. So it's just theoretical, right? We forget about all this knowledge that we have that could make us better if we practice more. And this is why the practice piece and progressively testing is so much smarter than just having, oh, here's your one day and we're going to judge you on that one day, and then that's going to be what you're locked into for a period of time until the next one day. That's never going to be as good training from the brain as you're putting into practice. So growth mindset, fixed mindset, it kind of is counterintuitive, because we understand that saying that somebody is slow is a negative, and it's unkind, and it's not helpful, right? What we don't understand is our tendency to say someone, I've never seen anyone ski so fabulously, you're a genius, or you're a superstar, you're the best skier I've ever seen. When you do that, when you praise skill or talent, what you're doing is locking the person into not wanting to ever try again, because they get extrinsic praise for something they've done well. They get into the mentality, I'm the best in this group of six kids. Cut to they are 3 or 4 years older and the competition's a lot steeper. They just fall to pieces. They don't have grit. They don't have growth mindset. They don't understand that the key to improving is not how talented you are, and this is a God-given thing. No, it has nothing to do with it. It's how hard you work. And so the beauty of growth mindset is you only ever talk about effort. So you say to your skier, not you are the best skier I've ever seen. That never comes out of your mouth. What you say is, I cannot believe how hard you worked today. You were just relentless in perfecting that thing that was bugging you, or the challenge that you had. Sorry, I have terrible ski instructor language. Everyone, please forgive
No,
me
it's
for
great.
being a bad ski instructor. I'm just trying to imagine the kind of language or things that you would say. I've never taught skiing in my life, which must be glaringly apparent, but you know what I mean.
Well, I
Yeah,
think you're
no,
onto
that's,
something though,
yeah, totally. Yeah.
is because often this comes up, right? As you train an instructor that has less experience, and they often go, well, what would I do? How could I help that person? And the reality is you could, because that continuum doesn't end, especially if you embrace what you just said, Jennifer, about like, comment on the work, comment on the effort, because that, there is no ceiling to what somebody can accomplish. Yeah, it's so cool.
Well, and it's a really important thing to remember too. All of this happens all the time in our lives. We have setbacks. So if you have an amazing skier who tears their ACL or breaks their leg or gets a concussion, and this is a nice one for Tom Brady too. Tom Brady got interested in brain training because he had suffered some concussions. And so instead of saying, my career is over, I'm older than everybody else out there playing, he said, you know what? I could probably get another 15 years out of this and compete with people whose brains are 20 years younger than mine. And I'm just going to have to work harder. I'm going to stretch better as an older person. I'm going to
Right.
make my brain really work hard by doing brain training every day. I'm going to keep being the athlete I want to be, even though I've had setbacks. It's okay. I can recover and I can be stronger.
I think it's so you gotta take a minute, and again, this is my observation, is to see where people are truly coming from. Like one of the things I can't, like, I have an example earlier this year. His experience with me was the first real time that he was out being social and so on, and to not jump into a conclusion of why some of his behaviors were the way they were, and trying to find out and make a connection with him, because it was truly one of his first ventures into a new world, and it was just really, and again, uh, um, to give you credit, having digested some of your stuff, I tried to keep my mind as open as possible to allow for space for connection, and it was really cool where that relationship went.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's that phrase that was about some research that is being done on Olympic athletes, and I never forget the title of the article, because the title of the article, which is about the research and what the research showed, and this is about Olympians that triumph versus Olympians that win the medals. So to
Right.
become an Olympian in the first place is the most ridiculous achievement ever. But then there's some that get medals. What's the difference between the two groups is what
Mm.
this research set out to look at. And what they found was that the people that win the medals, they have caring coaches. They have coaches that
Mm.
actually try to connect. They have coaches that see them as human beings, that understand that sometimes they're sick, or sometimes they're injured, or sometimes they're having terrible psychological days. They're just like caring, connecting people. And that's the difference. All the coaches have the same technical knowledge. They're all mind-blowing technical geniuses, but the ones that care bring their athletes to medals. And the title of the article is "A Coach Can Make or Break an Athlete." And, so Perry, for you in that moment to just be going, okay, this kid is acting, I've never seen a kid act like this before. Maybe you've never had a single mom homeschooled kid who grew up on video games. It's the first time. But for you just to open up to that and say, I just am going to meet him where he's at and like be curious and caring and compassionate and try and create connection on his terms. You created an amazing experience for him. If you hadn't come at it that way, you might have broken him. You might have turned him off
Well,
skiing. You know?
it's interesting as a ski instructor, my default position is when I ski down and stop, everybody will ski down and stop beside me. But oh, wait a minute, that didn't happen. And and it wasn't anything, it wasn't anything bad that had happened, but it just, that wasn't, what in my brain would be a default thing is like, well, okay, what's going on here? What do I need to figure out? As opposed to going, that's disrespectful. He didn't stop beside me.
Yes.
You,
Yeah,
you know, and
exactly.
it's
Oh
just,
gosh. That disrespect word is such a good word for all of us to
mhm.
recognize that we're feeling vulnerable. As soon as you find that word cross oh, that's defiant, that's disrespectful. You know that you're in your own issues.
Right. We've talked a lot, and you talk a lot about it in your book about the obvious or overt bullying, for example, that goes on, and the things that you can really put a name to, right? You can describe it, and it's in documents, harassment policies and things like that. What about the less obvious stuff, and even to the point where the most professional may be thinking that this way of approaching people, or this way of speaking to people, providing feedback, that kind of thing, it's as professional as I can do it. But are there things that potentially we could even be aware of at that level that may be, I'll say, like more bullying or harsher than what we actually think we're doing? I don't know if that makes sense as a question, but some of the things that we're not, like, you're not out there trying to be a bully, but in actual fact, you might be, by not understanding what you're saying or how you're saying it. Or can you speak a little bit to that? That's a big question, but
Yeah, well, I mean, I started studying bullying, and as you know, I don't look at kids. I'm much more interested in what adults do when they bully others, and that's
mm,
really where the research lies for me. I think children are not a useful demographic to look at if we want to change normalized bullying in our culture. That would be like looking at, as I say in the book, it's like you'd never look at a child population to change economic disparity or to address poverty or inequality or racism. Or so why would you look at kids and say, we have a society that's rife with bullying in all kinds of different forms, let's look at kids and study them, and then that's how we're going to figure it out? That's not ever going to change anything, and we know that because we've talked about child bullying until we're blue in the face, and it's on the rise, if anything. So
mm,
I specifically hone in on adult bullying behaviors and what they look like and what they sound like and so on and so forth. And what's really interesting is, and it makes it complicated. I mean, people always, especially in our culture, they want a really quick fix. They want you to
mm,
tell them what to do, and tomorrow it's going to be better. And that's not the brains don't work that way. Brains are like the body. If you're out of shape and you don't know how to get fit, and you spend all your time in an escapist mode, you're watching TV and eating chips on the couch, it's going to be really hard to get in shape, but you can absolutely do it. It's the same thing with the brain. And you could even argue it takes about the same amount of time. If you decide that being completely unaware of how you treat other people, even though you get lots of feedback that it's hurtful and harmful and destructive, and you're constantly being called on the carpet and you're constantly making excuses for why you do what you do, and so on and so forth, and victim blaming people that complain and say it's their fault and they've got a vendetta and it's a witch hunt and all the different things that it's textbook what individuals who are get bullying abuse reports on say, right? They say the same phrases over and over again, whether they're at the absolute top of the world political realm or if they're all the way down as a junior in an organization or a coach or teacher or whatever. So if we have that understanding, then we can start to say, okay, so if somebody can be rehabilitated who is abrasive, they use bullying behaviors in order to get results. And this has been studied at great length, and they find that this is looked at more in organizational culture than it is in sport culture. But it's the same thing. Sport culture, organizational culture, it's all the same thing. So they find that they can be a bully whisperer, an abrasive whisperer, and they can help that person get better. And it's hard work. They have to work really hard, but they do want to get better. People don't want to have fractious, unhealthy, unhappy, unsafe relationships with other people. Nobody gets up in the morning and goes, I really want to have just a horrible day of putting people down and swearing at them and yelling in their face and making them feel like garbage. Nobody does that, right? But why do you default into those behaviors? I find that people can understand this a lot faster if we talk other mammals, not human mammals. Let's talk dogs. If you have a dog that grew up in an abusive home where it was beaten every day and starved and neglected and not given any love or affection and was kept in a cage, that dog, in every single encounter going forward, when it sees a human being, it will project onto that human being, the owner that I've had that treated me this way, I'm in danger. And it will give off a lot of abrasive signals. It'll growl, it'll bare its teeth, it'll put its fur up. We all know the signs of an abused dog. It's like ready to take you out of the throat. Human mammals are the same. So when you see someone behaving in that very overt way, and I promise you, Jeff, I'm getting to the answer of your question, which was what about subtlety? I know I'm doing that, but I'm going to get down to subtle in a moment. When you see people behaving that way, you can recognize that they are feeling unsafe. And it can be, let's now look at a really subtle version. And this is, I'm talking to you about it, research right now. You're sitting in the bar, you're drinking a beer, and there's a guy down at the end of the bar, and he's drinking a beer. And you're talking to the bartender, and you've had a long day, and you're tired, and you're staying in a hotel because you're working. And you glance over at the guy just because your human brain is telling you need to know the environment on an unconscious level, check out who else is in the bar. You should know who's there, who's coming in and out the door. You can't help it. Your autonomic nervous system makes you pay attention to environment just in case there's something that might put you at risk. But you're a healthy, happy person, grew up in a nice home, had good attachment to your parents, good schooling, maybe some traumas here and there, but you're basically a healthy individual brain-wise. You don't know that the guy at the end of the bar, just like that dog, comes from extreme abuse. He's sitting at the bar, he's drinking his beer, you glance over at him, he turns to you and goes, what are you looking at? And you go, nothing, man, I'm not looking at anything. He hears disrespect. He breaks the bottle at the bar, comes over and kills you. That's research. I'm not making this story up. This is a research story that's part of the neuroscientific research that I study. So what do we do with that? I mean, you didn't do anything wrong. Your exchange in many ways was very subtle, but it went instantly to extreme violence. And that happens. That actually happens. So now let's look at the subtle person who is bullying. This person is the most dangerous. They come across as cult following, charismatic, intelligent, leader, absolute leader, very good at accruing and gaining power, very good at getting people to be in their camp. That person is 10,000 times more dangerous than the overt, I've been threatened and hurt bully, because you aren't prepared. Your brain is not prepared for the subtlety of what they do. And the subtlety of what they do is based on brain mechanisms. And I've had long debates and conversations with people who are experts in rehabilitating the abrasive person, because that's not what I study. I study I do to a certain degree. What I really study is the abusive person. The abusive person's brain, and they act in very subtle ways. They'll drop a little racist slur. They'll make a homophobic joke. You never are quite sure where they're coming from. One minute they're your best friend. Next minute you find out they've been stabbing you in the back. One minute they're talking to you about a promotion. Then you find out there's a smear campaign that they've generated about you. Like, they are the most chameleon untrustworthy, unsafe, unstable, unpredictable
Mm.
human beings out there. And they are manipulators. I mean, and oftentimes they come by it honestly, it comes from environmental factors. Some might be genetic, but basically the research thinks it's mostly environmental. Um, and they've learned to survive, and their brain has been shaped and wired in such a way that they don't. So, all this talk we've done about coaching and empathy, they don't have active empathic neural networks. So, they're not going to operate in usual ways. They don't have active emotional neural networks like regular people do that are regularly healthy brains. So, they don't have remorse. They don't have guilt. They're pathological liars. They don't mind seeing you be destroyed. They don't mind taking down the organization. They don't mind if learners get hurt. They don't bat an eye about firing someone who doesn't deserve to be fired. They're cut from a different cloth. And so in my work, what I really want to do is say we need to be trained to recognize these people and the red flags of who they are and what they do. Because so-called subtle bullying is actually a red flag of something that could be very, very dangerous. You don't have the impulse to harm other people if your brain is healthy. So when people's brains are unhealthy, it's like they have an infection or a virus, and we just let them run rampant. We don't put masks on them. We don't quarantine them. We don't try and get them better. As our society is massively out of date. We change laws all over the place when there was an actual virus, COVID, but we're not changing laws when we have 20 years at least of research about these kinds of narcissistic, psychopathic, Machiavellian individuals and what they do to other people's lives. And so I think this is one of the things we would be wise to start getting aware of and start training.
Because one of the things, and I want to get this right, that you say in the book, and I think you say it more than once, is the brain will only accept new information or a new way of looking at things if it perceives there's a benefit to it. One of the things that again, as I digest your content and I'm out there working with people, I'm trying to be very cognizant of everything that I'm doing so that it doesn't recreate a cycle. So that, like as an example, you meet with aggression, like let's say you come up to an interaction that is coming from an aggressive point of view or a sneaky point of view, to not respond in kind, if you will, and keep it in a safe place. I just find that, anyways, I find it, well, I guess what I'm sharing is I try to be very aware that I am doing the right thing and not letting my brain fall into the same traps that I think can happen to all of us at all times.
Okay, what I would say to that, I would have to disagree with you there.
Okay.
What I think is, if you are an empath and you are a person in a constant state of self-improvement and being more aware, more caring, more compassionate, better teacher, you in particular have to watch out for people who aren't coming with that same agenda.
Mm.
What you have to do, and people don't like to talk about these things. We don't like to talk about negatives. We don't like to, if you're empathic, you don't like to say something negative about someone else. You don't want to pass judgment. You don't want to say they are destructive, they're hurtful, they're damaging, they actually should probably not be part of the organization. Those are almost impossible things to say for you as an empath. So the empath in particular has to be very careful not to get manipulated, because the person that's non-empathic, that has some psychopathology and some narcissism, Machiavellianism, like there can be all different. And as you know, I write about it in the book. I talk about the brain, what their brains look like under brain scans, and they're not healthy. So just like you have to almost think sick person. If you came up to someone on the slope who had COVID and was coughing and sneezing in a heinous, terrible way, and you could see they were running a fever, you would be like, oh my God, I have to protect myself and I have to protect the others. That person can infect me and threaten my life. We have got to start training ourselves as a society to recognize that it's not a super high number, but it's a high enough number that what we tend to do with these people is give them more and more power. Just take a quick glance at politics right now, international political scene. Take a look at the people that have the power. Do you think they have healthy brains? Do we have any mechanism to even look at their brains and say, you know what, before we give you the keys to the nuclear code, we want to see that you've got a healthy brain? Because if you don't, probably not a good idea to give them access to nuclear power. But we don't do any of those things.
Yeah.
We pretend all the time in society that brains just don't exist even. But when you come at these things from a neuroscience point of view, someone like yourself would have to be careful that you're not letting your empathy override your sense that someone is dangerous and destructive, because you need to listen to that sympathetic nervous system, intuitive, high alert, something your brain is picking up on for your own safety and for the safety of the organization and the learners.
I do think these are things that us that aren't as knowledgeable as you will try to get our brain around, right? Like and try to figure out and try to make sense of what you of what the science says, because I think there's a lot of predetermined views that um that may not take some of the messages that your science brings at first light or at first go around. It won't accept them. And correct me if I get this wrong, is we're not necessarily programmed to accept something that is in our background. So in what I'm going through is I think it takes something to recognize it from a space of openness, and just receptiveness.
Yeah, this is really interesting to me, and I can already just feel that I'm going to force you to read drafts of this book as it starts to emerge. But it's a lot of this is about the focus of my next book, which is this idea of how do we construct reality. So, I mean, essentially, this is what we've been talking about the entire time, right? We don't talk about it as a society, but the neuroscience and the neurobiology and medicine and so on, they have a lot of knowledge about how our brains and bodies and nervous systems, they all work together, how they construct reality. And then we think reality is reality, right? Okay,
Right.
I'm sure this is just ski instructors are rolling their eyes going, why am I listening to this? Oh, she's crazy. But just bear with me for 1 second. So I just want to reinforce what you just said, Perry. It's true. It's like so to give you an example, I'll give you one quick experiment that's really famous that people might have heard of before, but they call it the gorilla experiment, I think. And what they did, the scientists did, was they said to these people, okay, look, we're going to roll these big red balls back and forth across the field. Your job, your task, what you have to do to succeed at this research experiment is you need to pay attention to how many times the balls are rolled back and forth across the field. And all the people are like, yes, I want to do well. I'm just a little kid who obeys authority. All of us have had this hammered into our brains that this is what we must do. We want to succeed at the task. So lo and behold, the people all do a really good job. They pay attention to the balls. But what the researchers did is they had a guy in a gorilla suit run down the middle of the field in the midst of the task. And a whole bunch of the people doing the task didn't see him. So that's just a really fast way of reinforcing what you said, Perry, which is that because of our brain wiring and what we're focused on, like if you're focused on getting your learners to pass a test, you might not see the guy in the gorilla suit because your brain is laser focused on the task. And the task is get these learners to pass level 1. It's going to show what a great teacher you are. Nobody left behind. You're the best teacher, blah, blah, blah. And so that they call it selective perception. Mm-hmm. Well, let's take selective perception one step further. Anybody who's ever been in an organizational crisis where bullying and abuse are occurring and those in power decide, and there's lots of reasons why they don't decide because they're bad leaders. They decide for a bunch of brain reasons that are really interesting, that are too complicated to get into right now, but we can talk about it later, another time. But if you've ever been in that situation where manipulative people are trying to take each other's work, that it's not about meritocracy, it's about cliques, it's about camps, it's about smear campaigns and put downs and manipulation, all these kinds of things. If you've ever seen that and sort of spoken up and said, wait, we can't do this, this is negative, it's destructive, it's unfair, or maybe there's racism or sexism or other bad stuff going down, and you're like, no, this is unfair. All of your colleagues who at the water cooler have been agreeing with you for the last 6 months that, yeah, this is really bad, this is negative, like this shouldn't happen. All of them put their blinders on and they say, we don't know what you're talking about. you've really gone out on a limb here. I'm going to look the other way. That's blind to betrayal, right? So going back to what we talked about earlier in the conversation, that's another way that you have selective perception. You have selective perception because your brain is telling you, you can't afford to lose this job. Maybe worse, you can't afford to lose this community. These are your people. This is your tribe. You really think you're going to walk away from this? Like, you can't. You won't even survive. Your brain's telling you, like, just like you wouldn't survive if you walked out in the Serengeti by yourself, you're not going to survive if you walk away from this community. And so people select not to see corruption. They'll select not to see abuse, and they will put their head down. And it's all just brain survival strategies. And yet, morally, we feel it's appalling. Emotionally, we devastated by it. But this stuff happens. It's textbook over and over and over again. And just to come full circle, Perry, it's exactly what you're describing. We construct reality with all kinds of biases and judgments and blinders on, and it's not reality. So all of us, our opportunity is to try and create realities that are healthy and encompassing and sustainable and take us all forward in ways that we want to go in, not just default modes because we have insecurities.
So question then, Jennifer, like, in a way, does that sort of make the argument that if we focus on the right stuff, then, like, back to the gorilla experiment, right? Like, if we're actually focused on the things that do matter, then does the gorilla matter anymore? Right? Did you see what I'm saying? Like, is that part of the answer, I guess, that we're talking about, is knowing, not being naive or unwilling to accept that there's bad stuff out there and so on, but balance that with, what are we aiming at, and where are we trying to go, and how will we know when we're there, and so on. Not the quick fix, but the legitimate, like, whether it's as an organization, as a community of people, as an individual out there doing your best in the world. Is that part of the key, I guess?
I think that if we care about social fabric, this is my literary self just coming out when I try and contain myself, but here it comes. I'm so excited by my metaphor that it's embarrassing. I was going to say, if we care about the social fabric, what we have to get good at is being able to shuttle out and shuttle in. We need to have both perspectives. We need to see the gorilla that's running across the field because maybe he's going to attack somebody, right? We need to see that guy and not just be laser focused on, I'm trying to please the people that set me this task. And we also want to be the guys that, yes, I know how to stay focused and eliminate distraction. So just trying to say both of those perspectives, I think what we want is, going back to Phil Jackson, is we want mindfulness. We want flow. We want to be able to be in a space sometimes where we let go of overthinking and time, and we just become part of a community, a social fabric. And that always is the most important. But what's really interesting right now that they're seeing in the research is, especially our young people, because they've grown up this way, but all of us, we're starting to change the way our brains perceive because we're so focused on phones. So imagine, we used to be like this. We used to be panning out, looking at a large environment because that's how we survived. All of a sudden, we're in a society where we're just lasered onto this little tiny square. Imagine over time what that's going to do to your peripheral vision. And then imagine whether or not you're going to be a safe driver. If you do not see the skateboarder, if you don't see the guy on the electric scooter, like the kid on the bike, the dog, the car coming from XYZ, like, you should almost not be allowed to drive if you don't get your peripheral vision tested, because we're so locked into these phones. So, I think those would be really interesting workshops to do. Actually, as an educator, I go, oh, that's really an interesting question. And there's a bunch of different ways we might teach that or think about that or get our athletes to think about it or whatever.
Have you read The Practice of Groundedness? Brad Stulberg, I think.
No,
is his
sounds
name.
good.
Yeah, that was actually one of the books that I'd read previous to yours that was one of the ones where I'm going, this is familiar, right? Like, you're just reminding me of some of the things in there, which is, like, the groundedness is not just about you being you and so on. It's like there's always a component of you needing to interact with with the outside world. You talk about your new book a little bit. You mentioned that the new book, and I'm not even sure how much I'm allowed to talk about it, but the the new one is sort of the this isn't right, but if I recall how you said it was, it's a little bit of the how do we do this right? Do you kind of see, if I can say, like a light at the end of the tunnel based on enacting certain things or certain behaviors, certain, I don't know, any thought there, and how do we pull the nose up on this thing?
Well, I think, and then my dad's a retired lawyer. So my dad says to me, in you, hope springs eternal. And it's an insult. He is just like, you are just such a Pollyanna. You just are always so positive. Like, you think everything's going to get better. And I'm like, and it will. And so, in answer to your question, I think we are at a tipping point of a scientific revolution. And it's a super exciting one, like they always are. So people always roll their eyes when I say this, when I present this to audiences. I'm like, this is a scientific revolution. And you just see them go like, oh, when is she going to be done? And here, let me make my case for this. So in my lifetime, I've already lived through 2 scientific revolutions, and you guys have too. First one was smoking. When we grew up, smoking was normal, right? Everybody smoked. Marlboro Man was smoking. We all wanted to be him. Who doesn't want to be on a horse out in the wilderness? Pretty cool, pretty tough. You want all your guys who want to be tough, right? They don't want to be soft. Marlboro Man is your guy. And all you need to do is buy cigarettes and you're with him, right? Okay, so, and then for the girls, we had Audrey Hepburn. It's like, who doesn't want to be Audrey Hepburn in a little black dress, smoking this thing, sophisticated, gorgeous actress? Like, every girl wants to be Audrey Hepburn. That was our growing up, right? Everybody smoked. You could smoke in high school. You had to go to the pit in my high school, but you were allowed to smoke. Teachers smoked, university profs smoked. Your doctor smoked when he wrote you a prescription, right? Okay, that was normal, totally normal. We've lived through the government, imagine the lawmakers and policy writers actually doing something. They turn around and they're like, yeah, you can't smoke anymore. Not on airplanes, even though they put that curtain between, the smoking part of that was useful. Thanks, guys. Thanks for protecting us. So that all happened, right? That happened in our lifetime. We witnessed that happen. You can't even light up a cigarette outside a building, like 20 feet away from the building. And it's like, oh, you might get fined. Maybe you'll go to jail if you smoke on the airplane. Like, we've come full circle, okay? So the way I think about the bullying abuse paradigm is the same way. It's secondhand smoke for a lot of us. It's not because people are evil. They don't bully and abuse because they're bad people or they're monsters. They bully and abuse because it was hammered into them growing up, just like smoking was hammered into us as an ideal, made you tough. They've had it hammered into them that it is a survival strategy. It's the way to get power. It's the way to get successful. It's the way to get prestige. And, we've got lots of confirming stuff in our world that tells us that actually is true. That's the world we live in. Bullying and abuse paradigm is smoke and secondhand smoke. Can that end? Well, smoking did. And then the other revolution that I think is relevant to this is the 1980s fitness revolution. All of a sudden, you've got Jane Fonda, she's dancing around, she's got the headband on, and she's telling us, guess what? You don't have to be an athlete. You don't have to be a great skier. You don't have to be a soccer player. You don't have to be a rugby player. You can just get fit, and it's actually really good for you. We didn't know that. We didn't know that jumping around and getting our heart rate up was going to be a game changer for health, happiness, and high performance for everybody. And it was. And this movement changed everything. Corporations, schools, you name it. Everybody started to create space for physical exercise that wasn't requiring skill, like aerobic dancercise or whatever they called it. Exercise, dancercise. Anyhow, that's 2 revolutions we've seen, and they both have to do with health. And they both have to do with science. And the really strong parallel between the smoking paradigm and the bullying abuse paradigm now is smoking back in the day. How did we find this all out that it actually wasn't good for us? It was invisible, the damage that was being done. It was destroying us on the inside. It was giving us cancer, but you couldn't see it. Along comes the X-ray. You can see the blackening, the tumors, the cancer. That was enough for us to go, because we're visual creatures. We're like, okay, hang on a second. Doesn't make you tough, makes you sick. absolutely identical scientific revolution happening right now, which is that we didn't know, but now that we have non-invasive technology, we have brain imaging, plus we have ultrasound. We can look at, what is happening to hearts, ECGs. What happens to a heart if someone who's in a manipulative, bullying, toxic environment? Well, it does really serious damage to your heart, to your lungs, to your gut, and especially to your brain. It does physical damage to your brain. It leaves neurological scars. I'm talking bullying and abuse that's subtle, that doesn't touch the body, that our laws even don't take it as
Mm.
seriously. It's not criminal to do it, but it does criminal damage to your body. So that's how we're just at this we're at this tipping point. And I think all organizations that embrace the science, it's 20 years old, peer reviewed, replicated, it's got consensus from scientists all over the world, 20 years of it. Like, it's time to integrate that now, exit the bullying and abuse paradigm, and enter into the new scientific revolution, which is, as you know in the book, I call it a neuro paradigm. Just means that we're brain informed. Brain science is changing every day. Do we have all the answers? No. Same thing with hearts and lungs and cancer. We don't have all the answers. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be implementing what we do have right now to be healthier, happier, and more high performing.
Yeah.
I so like, Jennifer, how you lay out those examples of the smoking, fitness, and where we are today. Because, and I mentioned this to you earlier too. In my interactions with people, there's we are on the cusp. It matters with people. In our case, people that we instruct, people that we coach, organizations that have employees. Ourselves. Like that awareness. Like I said, it's on the cusp, and I think it's so cool. Again, to go back and to have these conversations with you, because again, I think your insights, your research, it's so timely to give people real tools on how to move this forward. Like tools, I don't know if that's the right word, but perspectives and so on, awareness that,
Mhm.
when you talk about, like literally our ability, and I had this conversation literally with somebody the other day. It was a colleague out of the US, and they had done, in my opinion, quite a bit of groundbreaking work, a number of years ago, kind of identifying microaggressions and, hey, that shouldn't be part of our culture and so on. As the science becomes more known, if you will, because you mentioned it's 20 years old, but as we get to know it more, it's going to change the game yet again. Not unlike, hey, maybe the first go around of smoking might have been, well, maybe there's something wrong here. Maybe there's some correlation until you really did a deep dive in it, and like it's that connection is overwhelming, and thank God society responded to it. Everything that has to do with brain health, high performing brains, it's so cool.
Like, I get called to speak in front of lawmakers that are making decisions around psychological safety. And so they want me to come and share the science. And one of the things I say to them that we really need to understand, and I think cancer is a good one to hone in on here at this moment, because what we know right now is bullying and abuse, microaggressions all the way up to full scale violations, adversity in childhood that comes from adult, essentially cruelty. That sounds very judgmental. Adults passing on to children their own trauma. Let's put it that way. It's not so moral and judgmental.
Mm.
But when adults are, because of their own trauma, awful with children, abusive with children, neglectful with children. Okay, so we have a lot of science on that, and the science goes back to the late 1990s. And it is correlated. You could argue these children grew up with very little psychological safety. Okay. And what we now know is that is correlated with midlife chronic disease. So you have to make the mental leap of just a second that it was like what was done to them made them have things like cancer. So bullying and abuse that are like literally like secondhand smoke. You don't have to be doing it. It's very harmful to you to do it, bullying and abuse. But if you were on the receiving end of it and taking it in, it can make you as sick as smoking. Literally. Like this is well documented in the science. And most people don't understand that. So when I talk to lawmakers, I say, okay, you're using the phrase psychological safety. I'm not sure you really understand the full levels of what that means. What it means is neurological safety. Do you have the right to have a safe brain at work? You guys want to argue no, and it's not the institution's responsibility to create an environment where brains are safe at work. That is neurological safety you're talking about. You're also talking about physiological safety, because our organs are, it's invisible, our
Mm.
heart, our lungs, our nervous, our lymph nodes, we are all, our entire body brain system are getting impacted very negatively by toxic environments. It can be a toxic environment from asbestos. It can be a toxic environment from smoking. It can be a toxic environment from manipulative, psychopathic, narcissistic, or more overt, abrasive style bullying that is full of yelling and screaming and put downs and threats and so on.
And maybe just before I go to Jeff, I think it might have been the same podcast that I referred to, Jennifer, like Way of the Champions, because, and I don't think these were your words, but one of the other panelists used these words. What was it? Like the sneaky stuff, right? And to your point is, I find again, as I digest your material, like that is so valuable, because I think a lot of us don't get that part, right? Like, you drew the example of, like, if you were exposed to that environment, you may not be aware of what you're recreating, and so on. And that sneaky stuff, one in my brain, one visual that I have is, if you do X, what is it, what is that downstream effect of X? You may not, you may think it's irrelevant, unconsequential, but it really does have something. Like little things, like even if you just, like, as an example, don't include somebody in a conversation, that like any things that might appear, again, inert, but they're really not. And I find that awareness is so key. And I find, again, this is my opinion of your work, is that awareness will help us fuel that revolution going forward, to make, in our little worlds, whether it be with a class, in an organization, in a community, to make the world a safer place, is an awareness of the sneaky stuff.
Yeah. Sneaky or small or micro.
Yeah.
And the key is being compassionate. Like part of the self-awareness puzzle is to say, to be able to go the next day and say, no, I could see you had your hand up, you wanted to ask a question, but I just needed to get through the material and I had to get my lesson done and I didn't want to forget. And I'm so sorry. Like I
Mm.
ignored you and I didn't mean to. Please forgive me. You know, we're not perfect. Brain
Right.
learns by making mistakes. All of us make these mistakes all the time. But rather than letting it sort of haunt you at night and then you don't do anything the next day because you don't want to look vulnerable or like you made a mistake, God forbid, because it's been so trained into us that making a mistake early days in school is unacceptable. It's something to be ashamed of. We're shamed for making mistakes at early ages, and then throughout school and sports, it's like, ugh, yeah.
Well, and you see this a lot, right? In that awareness where you probably know that you did something, that you could have done something better. Like you did, a person put their hand up and you didn't get to them. And again, might have, whatever, that happens, right? But then instead of addressing it in a positive way, oh, I apologize, I didn't get to you. Maybe can we open up that conversation now? But what a lot of people do is they double down on protecting what they did, right? As
Right.
Of
opposed to going,
course.
you know what, I could have done that better, but here we are. Let's move forward, and how can I dig in and support you, and so on. Yeah.
Which I thought that, I mean, originally when I dug into your book, that was something that right away, well, I just found very interesting about how you addressed it. Was it, I'll tell, like, my expectation just on title alone and so on was, of course, it was about, we're going to talk about the brains of people who've been bullied, right? But you quite quickly go into the recognition of how it affects the bully and how it affects people who have been bullies, bullied, bullies, are currently, like, all of that, and which I think is it's certainly a healthy dose of food for thought, is that whole consideration of, well, do I go back, might seem trivial at the time, do I go back and apologize for not you know letting that person speak when their hand was up and whatever, and maybe it was an innocent mistake, but it actually does have an effect on you too, right? And there's a downstream effect there. Really, this isn't a conversation about um victims and perpetrators. It's about the fact that if we're going to talk neuroscience and if we're going to talk about brains, well, every one of those people has one, and somewhere in there there's an effect. In your book, I won't get this exactly right, but when you talk I think it's when you first introduce your work with Michael Merznick, you kind of portray a comment that he made about how difficult it was just to get even the scientific community to pay attention to the science. Do you have any way of providing perspective or giving a bit of an idea of where we're actually at? So like who understands it, who doesn't, and therefore what are the next steps? Fair question.
So I continue to work with Michael Merznick, who, for people who don't know him that are watching, he's one of the world's leading neuroscientists alive today, most highly awarded. In 2016, he got the Kavli Prize for Neuroscience, which is the top prize you can get in the world. And he has many, many other prizes and patents and so on. He's referred to by his colleagues as the father of neuroscience. The father of neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change. So the reason I just adore Dr. Michael Merznick is he was a young scientist. He's in his lab, and there's two heavy hitter, huge science. They've won the Nobel Prize, and they won the Nobel Prize that says the brain stops changing after about 3-4 years old. And they get the big prize, and the whole community is like, yay, you guys are the ones.
You were
Michael
wrong.
Merznick, he's in the lab, he's working away, and he's like, that's not what I'm seeing. I don't see that at all. I see brains are changing and changing and changing, like right into the last minute the person's on the planet. So he of course, pretty brave guy, gets out there and tells the community, he's like 30 something, and he's like, yeah, you know what, those guys are wrong, and here's what I'm seeing in my lab. And the whole, oh gosh, he's ridiculed, he's treated like he's a simpleton, he's like, go back to your cage, that kind of thing, which we do in society. So I love the group right now out there that's very vocal and very clear, and they're very opinionated, and they're like, ooh, safe sport is not the way to go, and it's going to make us all soft, and kids don't have grit, and they're just a bunch of snowflakes, and kids today are spoiled, and they're entitled, and the millennials, and that's the neuroscientists refer to those guys as the status quo keepers. Fair enough. They don't want to have their worldview rocked. They don't want to be challenged. They don't want their reality to be told to them is not actually accurate. That's all very, very unpleasant. And all of us know that feeling, right? So Michael Merznick just basically stuck to his guns. And so in answer to your question, Jeff, right now in the scientific community, it's an absolute established fact that we all have neuroplasticity. Michael Merznick's groundbreaking work with other world-renowned neuroscientists until our final days on the planet. We can change our brains by what we practice, but our brain can also be changed by our environment, which means not just the environment like nature, but the environment of our relationships with other people. All those things change our brains. So we have a huge amount of power. This is very empowering. What we practice is going to change our brains. We can make it stronger, healthier, more high performing, have more grit, whatever we want, kinder, more diplomatic, more aware. Whatever we want to do with our brains, better at math, play the piano, be a better skier, be an excellent instructor. That's all, like, sky's the limit. It's up to us. On the flip side, we're very affected by our environment, and we always will be. Interpersonal relationships and our world around us, nature. So where are we? This is, I think this is why Michael Merznick gives me the time of day, because as I try to explain to him sometimes when he's mad at me, I'm just like, we can't all be geniuses. Like, some of us are just normal, and you have to be patient with me. But the reason why I'm helpful to him is because I'm an educator. So I feel like instructors, educators, it's our time to shine. The science is there. It's being done. The geniuses did it. Thank you, Michael Merznick, and all the world neuroscientists, neurobiologists, doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists. It's sitting there for us to take, but it's going to require, if we're going to make a big scientific revolution, it's going to take a beating of the drum of the educators now to make it applicable and practical. And going back, Perry, to what you were saying, are they tools? The way I think about it in the book is evidence-based practices. So essentially trying to say to everyone from chapter 1 on, as you know in the book, I'm like, okay, here's what the science says, here's what we can do. Like, we have to be practical and apply it and put it into process. So I think this is the time right now where education is the key, and just building a shared vocabulary and an understanding. And all it does is, I mean, neuroscience really, in many ways, just confirms what we already know. We already know that aerobic exercise is incredibly healthy for the body. Well, it's also incredibly healthy for the brain. And if the brain has been bullied and traumatized and abused, it is like a cure. It reduces cortisol, which is a very destructive when it's out of control in our brains and bodies. It reduces the cortisol, the stress hormone, and it pumps up BDNF, which is like fertilizer for the brain. It's critical for brain health. And guess what? Bullying and abuse, in all of its subtle forms and all of its very overt forms, damages BDNF in the brain. And that stands for brain derived neurotrophic factor. It's fertilizer for the brain. And if you don't have that fertilizer, it's not going to grow and have neuroplasticity and neurogenesis in the way that it should. So, I mean, that's just a snapshot. So, where are we? I mean, I just think we got to get going, like galvanize, like get people listening, get them excited. You guys are already working wonders, just saying, you got to read this book. You got to think about this different way of doing things. Let's get some speaking opportunities. Let's talk to each other. Let's get a podcast out. That's the way to do it, I think.
On that note, you recommended this. Really, really good. Perry, have you checked
I
this
haven't
out?
touched it yet. No.
Yeah. But like the whole like discussion around like the fertilizer for the brain, the BDNF discussion, like it goes deep into that, which was super helpful for me to figure it out as well. So good one. Thanks for that.
I think one of the cool positive things, one of my takeaways, it is an exciting time, especially when you cite how we can change, like how that neuroplasticity doesn't end, if we allow it. So that's super cool. And I just want to thank you for the conversation, and thanks, like as Jeff and I have had these conversations with you, it's just so cool to be going down this road. People are ready to hear this message, and this will take us completely to a new era. Yeah, thanks so much for the conversation today, Jennifer. Really, really appreciate it, and look forward to more in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for listening to me rant and rave and up on my soapbox and carrying on, and takes a lot of patience.
No, it's great. And for me too, Jennifer, thanks. And I think where we go from here is a little, well, to use your words, a little bit, the sky's the limit. It's having a big effect already in small ways, but I'm stoked. I'm really excited about where we go from here. So thank you.